Bacevich is a graduate of West Point, served 23 years as an Army officer. He earned his PhD from Princeton, and he's currently the Professor Emeritus of History and International Relations at Boston University. He is also a Tanner Lecturer at Stanford, author of numerous articles and books, and his most current is titled America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Military History. Without further ado, Dr. Bacevich.
Thanks very much. So the book just came out 2 weeks ago, and the mids that are here are supposed to be able to get a free copy there at the door, so don't miss out on your chance. I told one of them that his job was to go to the bookstore and ensure that the book is available in quantity for sale to the rest of the brigade, and preferably to the faculty as well. So I'm grateful to have a chance to talk to you. In general, it seems to me when I attend events that relate to U.S. civil-military relations, the conversation tends to be between practitioners and social scientists. I am neither. I am a historian. Historians basically tell stories and then offer some interpretation of what the stories they tell might mean. So that's the perspective I'm going to come at this thing from. We have an hour. I think I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, so we'll have a little time for questions, and then I'm off to catch an airplane. History, Henry Stimson once observed, is often not what actually happened, but what is recorded as such. And the difference between the reality and record does not emerge by accident. It reflects the interests of those in a position to influence the recording. When it comes to the history of U.S. civil-military relations, the gap between actual events and the story woven from those events looms especially large, in my judgment. It does so because the gap has served and continues to serve an important function. What we might term the approved interpretation of U.S. civil-military relations offers a sanitized version of the past designed to affirm and reassure. According to that interpretation, there's really not much of a story to tell. Assessing the health of civil-military relations according to a single criterion, the propensity of soldiers to overthrow the government, the approved version of events finds those relations to be beyond reproach. Notably, since the United States emerged as a global power during World War II, there is no evidence, none, suggesting that the American Officer Corps has ever plotted a coup or even contemplated the possibility of doing so. As for the man on horseback, the general bent on seizing power illegally, he exists only in the fevered imagination of pulp fiction writers and sensation-flogging filmmakers. In practice, the otherwise highly permeable world of modern politics has never accommodated an American Caesar. Granted, from time to time, evidence of civil-military tension, even animosity, erupts into public view. General Douglas MacArthur's clash with President Harry Truman during the Korean War being the most notorious example. But these incidents are explained away as anomalies, unwelcome perhaps, but merely temporary departures from the norm. In a formal sense, therefore, civilian control of the military has remained sacrosanct. The constitutional order is secure. According to proponents of this conventional view, the conclusion is axiomatic. No coup, no problems. And with regard to the history of U.S. civil-military relations more generally, no real story. Who benefits from this benign interpretation? The answer to that question lies first in appreciating the extent to which the vast realm of programs and activities encompassing what Americans refer to as national security policy has, since World War II, become the particular preserve of a self-contained, self-perpetuating elite. The impact of democratic processes on basic issues related to U.S. national security is negligible. Decisions to forge alliances, to go to war, to expand, contract, or reconfigure U.S. forces, to deploy them abroad, to acquire new weapons or to arm other countries, these fall within the purview of a small directorate consisting of high-ranking civilian officials, both elected and appointed, and senior military officers, along with a handful of legislators, corporate executives, policy-oriented academics, and insider journalists. In deciding such matters, members of this elite neither seek nor seriously consider the views of the larger public, whom they are inclined to see as inherently suspect anyway. For their part, conditioned by habits developed during the protracted emergency of the Cold War, most citizens, even today, dutifully accept their exclusion from such matters. For members of this national security elite, perpetuating this deference and their monopoly over policy ranks as an objective of paramount importance. Toward that end, a reading of history that describes relations between the civilian and military authorities as reliably harmonious and that credits American soldiers with being reliably submissive to their civilian masters is eminently useful. Such an interpretation does several things. First, it seemingly refutes the very improbable, quoting now, the very improbable supposition that any people can long remain free with a strong military power at the very heart of their country. The words are those of Samuel Adams, urging in 1768 that, quote, a wise and prudent people will always have a watchful and jealous eye on the soldiers in their midst. This sentiment, notably, this sentiment remained a central tenet of American Republican ideology long after Sam Adams had passed from the scene. Portraying U.S. civil military relations as uneventful sustains the notion that such concerns have long since now become irrelevant. Furthermore, by ostensibly showing that liberty and military power are not incompatible, the benign view of U.S. civil military relations helps make palatable the maintenance of an immensely powerful and permanent military establishment. For members of the national security elite, that establishment constitutes the wellspring of careers, riches, fame, and the ultimate narcotic, namely access to the innermost circle of power and the opportunity to participate in decisions ostensibly affecting the course of world history. Above all, this prevailing view of U.S. civil military relations reassures the American people that they have nothing to worry about. And by extension, it deflects any inclination of ordinary citizens that ordinary citizens may have of prying into matters over which the national security elite has become accustomed to enjoying exclusive oversight. All of which might be fine, were it not for the fact that the interpretation of U.S. civil military relations to which Americans are habitually invited to pay homage is wildly misleading. Further, the very persistence of that interpretation conceals the pernicious implications of actually existing civil military arrangements and practices. To begin with, the absence of coups or coup attempts alone does not qualify as proof of effective civilian control, any more than the absence of fistfights on the floor of Congress qualifies as evidence of legislative bipartisanship, or the absence of blatant fraud and stock manipulation is proof of corporate responsibility. Genuine civilian control has a positive as well as a negative aspect. That is, in addition to shielding the constitutional order from the danger of a military takeover, it also, or at least ought to, create a framework within which soldiers and civilians collaborate to advance the national interest. The dialogue forming the nexus of this collaboration implies give and take, candid, and perhaps even contentious. But the principle of civilian control mandates that the dialogue proceed consistent with the common understanding that whatever the issue, at the end of the day, civilian masters will prevail and soldiers will abide by their decisions. But even this more expansive understanding of civilian control does not suffice to define a healthy civil-military relationship. Ultimately, it is not simply the tenor of civil-military discourse that counts, but the quality of the decisions that result. Even if the norms of civilian control are honored, civil-military interaction that produces defective policies, resulting in waste, needless loss, or even defeat, is inherently flawed. Based on these criteria, open and honest dialogue, consistent with the norms of civilian supremacy and effective policy outcomes, the historical record is at best mixed. Indeed, to consider what actually happened rather than what has been recorded as such is to realize that civilian control of the military during the entire post-war era has frequently been contested, at times highly contingent, and on a few occasions downright precarious. To be sure, with rare exceptions, the principal actors in and out of uniform carefully observe the formal conventions of proper behavior. But beneath the surface, a different reality prevails, in which the operative mechanism is not a dialogue informed by mutual respect and a recognition of civilian supremacy, but mutual manipulation informed by suspicion and mistrust, driven as often by narrow self-interest as by any concern for the common good. So a 7 days in May conspiracy to overthrow the government is an impossibility. Shy of orchestrating a coup, however, senior officers or their subordinates acting on their behalf engage in all sorts of shenanigans to advance the agenda of a particular command, service, or individual. For public consumption, all parties punctiliously observe the requisite priorities, but these no more define the actual relationship than do the courtesies that a philandering husband extends to his wife on the occasion of their anniversary, as both parties to that relationship fully understand. In other words, civilian control not infrequently functions as little more than a slogan, a useful fiction, concealing a reality that is far more fractious, combative, and problematic. In short, while it is true that the United States military has never, since 1945, posed a threat to the constitutional order, that truth, noteworthy in its own right, obscures hardly less important truths about the reality of U.S. civil-military interaction. For evidence of civil-military dysfunction, we need look no further than the period since 9/11. This period has seen U.S. forces continuously engaged in operations in various parts of the Islamic world. We have fought the two longest wars in our history, neither of them producing conclusive success. More broadly, the national security apparatus, and I'm including here both senior civilians and senior military officers, the national security apparatus appears to be clueless as to how to achieve success or to extricate the United States from what has become a condition of permanent war. Now, there is no single explanation for the sorry situation in which we find ourselves, but a defective civil-military relationship certainly qualifies as a contributing factor. Consider, for example, the interaction of senior civilians and senior military officers during the period leading up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, neither of whom had any firsthand experience with war, had very specific ideas about how a preventive war targeting Iraq ought to unfold. Both were believers in the so-called revolution in military affairs, the product of theorists who believed that information technology was transforming the very nature of war. For the technologically adept, fog and friction were supposedly things of the past. Precision, speed, and agility, they were now the new determinants of victory. Both Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz believed further that coercive regime change in Baghdad would lead ineluctably to various beneficial outcomes. They therefore discounted the concerns of military professionals, notably Army Chief of Staff Erich Shinseki, who warned that occupying Iraq was likely to be a challenging proposition. When Shinseki dared to express those concerns in testimony before a Senate committee, his civilian superiors wasted no time in slapping him down, thereby warning other senior officers of the fate that awaited them should they dare to express public disagreement with administration policies. And soon enough, of course, events validated the very concerns that Shinseki had voiced. Payback came soon enough. By the spring of 2006, as the Iraq War entered its fourth year, officers unhappy with the civilian leadership's handling of the conflict were focusing their eye on Secretary Rumsfeld, whom they described as an arrogant micromanager. A growing chorus of recently retired generals called for his ouster. Lieutenant General Greg Newbold, who had occupied a senior position on the Joint Staff after 9/11, offered an even wider indictment, chiding Pentagon civilians for committing U.S. forces to war, quoting Newbold now, with a casualness and swagger that are the special province of those who have never had to execute those missions or bury the results. Newbold revived the discredited MacArthur doctrine of 1951, claiming that a senior officer's allegiance was, quote, not to a person, but to the Constitution. Newbold issued, quoting, a challenge to those still in uniform to resist policies they found objectionable. Well, immediately following the off-year elections of 2006, Rumsfeld's critics got what they wanted, and he was gone. His ouster, at least in some measure, hastened by the military officers whose counsel he had rejected. Well, in an attempt to redeem the Iraq War, President Bush now appointed a new defense secretary, and more importantly, a new commander in Iraq, who came bearing a new doctrine. The RMA was gone, shock and awe forgotten, and counterinsurgency, or COIN, now emerged as the new theology. The advent of David Petraeus and the significance briefly assigned to the Iraq surge over which he presided tilted the civil-military balance in favor of the generals. War was now simply too important an enterprise to be left to civilians. So a public disenchanted with Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, while smitten with Petraeus, came to believe. And senior members of the officer corps were quick to exploit the opening that this change in mood presented. George W. Bush's departure from office and his replacement by someone unschooled in war, and statecraft, and in how to deal with generals, provided a tailor-made opportunity to do just that. Soon after Barack Obama became president, he decided it was time to change commanders in Afghanistan, exercising a prerogative rightly his as commander-in-chief. He chose for the position General Stanley McChrystal, who had distinguished himself in running counterterrorism operations in Iraq for the previous several years. McChrystal set off for Afghanistan with this charge: report back within 60 days with a concrete proposal for how to turn around the war using the additional resources that Obama had already agreed to provide. The idea was that McChrystal would recommend the president, taking the counsel of his military and civilian advisors, would decide, and then McChrystal would loyally implement that decision. And with characteristic energy, McChrystal immediately went to work. Within a mere 10 days of his arrival, he notified Defense Secretary Robert Gates that conditions in Afghanistan were far worse than he anticipated. Within a month, word was reaching the Pentagon that McChrystal's as yet unfinished campaign plan was likely to require troops well beyond the increment that Obama had already approved. Soon, press reports were previewing McChrystal's likely request for reinforcements even before he had provided the administration with a rationale for why they might be needed. Well, on August 30, 2009, McChrystal did submit his assessment to Secretary Gates, containing many assertions, but few facts. The 66-page document was long on exhortation and short on reasoned analysis. McChrystal began his assessment on a portentous note. "The stakes in Afghanistan are high," he wrote. Although, quoting, "success is achievable," he emphasized, quoting, "it will not be attained simply by trying harder. The key was to win over the population, which," quoting, "represents a powerful actor that can and must be leveraged." Leveraging Afghan hearts and minds meant that the troops under his command needed, quoting, "a fundamentally new way of doing business." NATO forces required, quote, "a new operational culture that connects with the powerful will of the Afghan people, implicitly assumed to be of one mind." As a supposed basis for a military campaign, the document was, in a word, squishy, and as empirically vague as the propaganda that had once touted the RMA as providing a surefire recipe for victory. Most strikingly, in describing the way ahead, McChrystal did not make even a pretense of weighing a range of possible alternatives. His commander's assessment contained no option A to compare with B and C. There was only A, what he called a comprehensive counterinsurgency campaign. Well, the Obama administration received this recommendation without enthusiasm, to put it mildly. McChrystal's coin campaign was going to require more troops. Within the White House, an unwelcome prospect. Worse, McChrystal's presentation deprived Obama of choice. In effect, the general's message to his commander-in-chief was, "Here, rubber stamp this." As if to drive, where am I here? Yeah, as if to drive home the limits of Obama's freedom of maneuver, General Petraeus, now commanding CENTCOM, chose this particular moment to offer his views on Afghanistan to Michael Gerson, a Washington Post columnist of decidedly hawkish persuasion. His standing as a military oracle at its height, Petraeus was especially well regarded in Republican Party circles. And before reinventing himself as a pundit, Gerson had spent years working as a senior aide to President George W. Bush. Now, Petraeus cheerfully shared with Gerson his considered opinion that in Afghanistan, quote, "the core principles of counterinsurgency still obtain." True, applying those principles was going to require, quoting Petraeus, "a lot more resources." But overall, Petraeus seconded the hints coming from McChrystal's headquarters in Kabul. "We have to regain the initiative," he told Gerson. "We have to get ahead of this, to arrest the downward spiral, to revive momentum." So as in Iraq, so too in Afghanistan, coin was the answer. And by implication, it was incumbent upon Obama to recognize the obvious. Well, back in March 1951, to vent his unhappiness with the way President Truman, a Democrat, was interfering with his conduct of the ongoing Korean War, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur had sent a letter to Speaker of the House Joseph W. Martin, a Republican. In that letter, quickly released to the public, MacArthur had expressed wonderment that anyone would disagree with his own assessment of the stakes in Korea. Petraeus was arguably the most overtly political senior military officer to grace the American stage since MacArthur. And as with MacArthur's letter to Speaker Martin, his interview with Gerson constituted a veiled challenge to the authority of the commander-in-chief. But Petraeus' interview turned out to be only the opening salvo in an effort to pressure the green-as-grass commander-in-chief into giving the seasoned warfighter whatever he wanted. A leaked copy of McChrystal's assessment soon made it into the hands of the Washington Post, and in short order, the full 66 pages were available to anyone with access to the internet. McChrystal himself got into the act, appearing on the television program 60 Minutes, and then promoting his plan via a highly publicized presentation in London. After the London speech, a reporter asked McChrystal if he could envision any alternative to a counterinsurgency approach to Afghanistan. McChrystal's answer? The short answer is no. Well, Obama grudgingly acceded to the general's wishes. And in a speech to cadets at West Point on December 1st, 2009, the president unveiled his version of a surge for Afghanistan. 30,000 additional U.S. troops would be heading to that country. The aim of the undertaking, Obama said, was, quote, to seize the initiative, while building the Afghan capacity that can allow a responsible transition of our forces out of Afghanistan. Now, Obama's presentation at West Point fell well short of being a full-throated battle cry. Still, McChrystal had gotten most of what he wanted, and Coyne was going to get a second try. McChrystal wasted no time implementing the president's decision, choosing Marja, a city of approximately 80,000, as the right place to validate Coyne's relevance to Afghanistan. Now, apart from adhering to a common religious tradition, Afghanistan and Iraq are about as much alike as opium and oil. Even so, McChrystal was expecting just as clear, hold, and build had worked its magic in the one country, so too it would surely work in the other. Seldom has the tendency of generals to fight the last war all over again been more vividly on display. Codenamed Mushtarak, the operation to liberate Marja, kicked off overnight on February 13, 2010, with an assault by U.S. Marines. After coalition contingents cleared the city of insurgents, Afghan security forces were there to hold it, and then with plenty of outside help, agencies of the Afghan government were going to swoop in to rebuild. Phase 1 promised to be doable, Phase 2 challenging, Phase 3 the really hard part. Even so, McChrystal expressed confidence. We've got a government in a box, ready to roll in, he promised. And indeed, once successfully transformed, Marja would offer a model for application elsewhere. Marja is an opening salvo, one senior Pentagon official promised. It is a first step. Success in Marja would create, quote, a shift in momentum, setting the stage for comparable successes elsewhere in Afghanistan. Well, actual results achieved soon punctured such hopes. True, the initial stages of Mushtarak's clearing phase began reasonably well. By February 25th, the Afghan flag was flying over the center of the city, and yet although armed resistance in Marja subsided, it did not end. Indeed, the local Taliban regrouped and adapted within short order a campaign of intimidation intended to dissuade the local population from cooperating with outside intruders was taking its toll. In late May, McChrystal himself all but conceded failure. The city intended to serve as a Coyne showcase, he conceded, had instead become, quote, a bleeding ulcer. The troops charged with implementing Coyne found that in practice, neat distinctions between clear, hold, and build simply did not hold up. Theory did not translate into reality. Worst of all, the promised improvements of everyday life failed to materialize. Operation Mushtarak might well have been called Operation Sand Against the Wind. McChrystal himself seemed to grasp the underlying explanation for that failure. Those charged with presiding over the war in Afghanistan, he subsequently remarked, entertained, quoting now, a superficial understanding of the situation and a frighteningly simplistic view of recent history, an indictment in which McChrystal included himself. Now, how McChrystal might have applied these insights is impossible to say because the general himself soon departed from the scene, having spent the better part of a career in a realm where keeping secrets secret and journalists at arm's length constitute basic survival skills, McChrystal had invited a reporter to become a de facto member of his military household. This unfathomable decision produced predictable results. The reporter affirmed his pre-existing anti-war credentials by publishing an expose that quoted McChrystal's chief aides, Team America, in their own estimation, mocking senior members of the Obama administration as clueless clowns, with the general himself joining in the fun. In a system of civil-military relations that values the observance of proprieties above all else, the general had now committed an unpardonable offense. Sparing Obama from having to fire him outright, McChrystal resigned his position and retired. In doing so, of course, he also spared himself from having to confront the fact that his much-hyped campaign to turn around the Afghanistan war had flopped. Yet, if nothing else, here it seemed was confirmation that the existing system of civil-military relations worked as intended. McChrystal's quiet departure seemed to affirm that the principle of civilian control was intact. In fact, the episode offered further insight into the flaws permeating the existing civil-military arrangements. As in Iraq, so too in Afghanistan, manipulation and game playing had taken precedence over honest civil-military dialogue. In Iraq, arrogant and ignorant civilian policymakers had prevented the generals from interfering in the war that they had envisioned. In Afghanistan, the reverse occurred. The generals got the war they wanted, and it turned out to be a bust. Crucially, in neither case did the results advance the national interest. In both cases, it was ordinary soldiers who bore the mournful consequences. Thus has the civil-military reality that pertained throughout the Cold War persisted to the present day. Factions of the national security elite, both civilian and military, vie with one another behind closed doors to control policy. All remain united in their collective determination to exclude the people, assumed to be ill-informed, vacillating, and untrustworthy. In this sense, more than any other, it is possible to argue that the existing system of civil-military relations has achieved its intended purpose. Thank you very much. So we've got what time are we supposed to end? Well, okay, so we got 25 minutes for discussion. Yes, sir.
I'm very sympathetic to your argument, and not this book, but many others. But how do we solve the problem that our political leaders keep deciding we're going to go do these things, leaving the generals in the position that you articulate, namely having to figure out how to make something that runs with loss of blood of what they're doing? For example, one of my former students is John Campbell, who came out of Afghanistan, and I watched him, listen to him, give sort of happy talk about what's happening in Afghanistan now. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't really believe it, but he's kind of in a position where he's got to say it.
Well, I tried to emphasize at the outset of my presentation, I am not a practitioner. I'm a historian. I try to tell stories and try to explain what the stories might mean. And I genuinely mean that. So I have no particular solution to this problem. I do believe that the beginning of a solution is for us, in the context of this ongoing war, what I call America's war for the greater Middle East, is to acknowledge the failure of that enterprise, the irreversible failure of that enterprise. That our efforts to do, I think the lingo frequently used in the Pentagon, our efforts and our expectations of being able to shape large parts of the Islamic world ain't going to happen.
Is it the
And if I may finish, and only if we are willing to acknowledge this, the failure of this misguided military enterprise, does it then become possible to move the discussion of policy to a different plane, and therefore to recognizing our military failure brings into view the possibility of demilitarizing U.S. policy in the greater Middle East, of considering alternative approaches to satisfying our interests, and quite frankly, enabling us to pay attention as a nation to concerns of far greater moment than events in the Middle East.
So, who's the we?
The we is the American people.
Okay.
That we've earlier today, there's been references made to the extent to which the American people are disengaged, not attuned to, not invested in, frankly don't care about the direction of national security policy. Again, my argument is that didn't just happen. It's because the national security elite has sought to and has been successful in excluding the people from playing any serious role. So the people are going to have to reawaken, re-engage, and insist upon change. Is that likely to happen? Absolutely not. I mean, indeed, it seems to me that the current presidential campaign is illustrative of how unlikely any change is going to occur. Because in the presidential election campaign, there is no serious discussion of the failure of our military efforts in the Islamic world. There are simply glib promises to bear down, try harder, bomb ISIS, let's see if the sand glows, and no effort on the part of any candidate to take into account the events of the past 3+ decades in that part of the world, what they have cost and what they have yielded. And we, the people, let the politicians get away with that narrowly defined dialogue on foreign policy.
Is it, in your judgment, part of the ethical obligation of senior military leaders when they find themselves in the midst of a failing military operation to say clearly that's what they've done? Should John Campbell, for example, say, this isn't working?
Yes, they should. They should say it to the people they work for. And they should say it in the clearest conceivable language. I think it's highly unlikely that they would say that because senior military officers are deeply invested in a particular status quo that presumes that American military power is this all-purpose instrument, that the adroit use of American military power can shape events in some place like the greater Middle East. So it is asking them a lot to acknowledge failure. An interesting exception, I think, is the book that Lieutenant General Bolger published, roughly a year ago, Why We Lost. A, acknowledging failure. B, I think his argument assigned more importance to generals than they deserve, but his argument was that we lost in Iraq and Afghanistan because we, the generals, failed to do their job properly. But that my sense would be that the Bolger admission did not catch on in national security circles.
And even if it did, it just states the problem, right? Because it's not that they didn't do their job properly, it's a job that shouldn't have been done.
No, I think both are true. The job shouldn't have been done, and they didn't do their job properly. Yes?
One institution that really seems to have abdicated any sort of responsibility or involvement is Congress. Where do you put them?
Well, they are part of that elite. I mean, members of Congress benefit by perpetuating the emphasis on military power, the bogus claims of American global leadership being largely a military enterprise. That's what sustains, I'm saying this very crudely and I apologize for that, but that's what sustains the military-industrial complex. Certainly we recognize that the military-industrial complex Its perpetuation is something that is greatly valued by some considerable number of members of Congress, so they're part of the problem. I mean, this whole notion of declarations of war and authorizations to use military force is an example of that. I mean, there's been this sort of somewhat, I think, on the margins debate over the course of the past year or so, right? Shouldn't we renew? I mean, does it make sense to have the war against ISIS and involvement in the Syrian civil war take place under the authorization to use military force that was passed in the immediate wake of 9/11? Clearly, ISIS didn't have anything to do with 9/11. Clearly, the Syrian civil war is not pertinent to that. And so whether the president means it or not, or whether he's just sort of playing games, I don't really know, but he has asked the Congress, he hasn't asked for a declaration of war, which we should insist there should be, but he has asked for another authorization for the use of military force directed against ISIS, and Congress has abdicated that completely. Don't want to touch it, don't want to be responsible. I mean, certainly that is one indication of the paralyzing dysfunction of American politics that we're confronting. And again, what's the solution to that? I mean, there are no solutions as long as the American people are willing to tolerate that. And sadly, we are. Yes?
I'm curious, if you look back at the MacArthur example, the public discourse on national security issues was certainly not as frequent or as omnipresent as it is now.
The public discourse?
The public discourse, at the levels of detail that we see now. And I'm curious how much you think this drive toward transparency, which turns into things like CENTCOM talking about individuals being deployed, individual artillery pieces being destroyed, or the civilian side releasing policy leanings as trial balloons. How much has that actually suppressed meaningful private discourse like you're talking about, and how much does it just seem to have done that?
That's a good question, which I have not thought about at all. I mean, the premise of the question, correct me if I'm misstating it, is that back in circa 1950, 1951, there was less public attention given to contentious national security issues? Because I wouldn't agree with that premise.
I think there was as much public attention, but it was of a different sort. It was a discussion about a national decision and how it was being.
I mean, I would argue that at least as a historian, my historian's understanding of the quality of debate over national security matters is back then it was at a higher level and was probably more fruitful. I mean, there were enormous debates with regard to atomic weapons and who should control them, what agencies within the national security apparatus should control them, their utility, their role in national security strategy. Enormous debates revolving around the priority assigned to Europe versus preferences for assigning greater priority to Asia. Enormous discussions over this is prior to the beginning of the Korean War, over the appropriate size of the military budget. And those, it seems to me, and of course there were enormous debates over the Korean War itself and its conduct. And it seems to me those are the kinds of debates that ought to occur and don't today. Again, to repeat myself, it just strikes me that 3.5 decades after we began the militarization of U.S. policy in the greater Middle East, it's time to take stock. Sort of ask ourselves, how's this going? I mean, are we winning? I mean, when's it going to end? Are the stakes worth it? And those questions simply don't get asked. The questions that get asked relate to the very particulars of the ongoing ISIS campaign, and to your point, that the additional deployment of 200 soldiers and I guess permission to now use 8 Apache helicopters that are already present in theater, that becomes a big story. Those are trivial stories, and the big story goes unreported and undiscussed. Yes?
So when you described the transition from Bush to Obama, you focused on the rising star of Petraeus and the reaction to Bush's failure. I wonder how much the conservative bent of the military plays into this, though. Because it seems to me like in 2008, a couple other things were going on. One was the Democrats saw an opportunity to try to reach out and capture the people who viewed them as anti-military. And in order to do that, they need to show themselves receptive to military advice. One of many things. And another thing is, it seems like the shift under Bush to embrace a certain theory and override the military couldn't have taken place if the Republicans didn't
I'm sorry,
feel they had
did Bush overrode, oh, you're talking about 2003?
Yeah,
Overrode, okay.
he couldn't have accomplished what he did if he didn't feel like he had like a certain critical mass of support within the military. And it could be the case that Obama felt like he didn't have the critical mass of support to stand up to the military establishment as a Democrat. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Well, first of all, the first thing is that the Democrats have been trying for decades now to refute the perception that somehow they are anti-military, that they are no longer the party of George McGovern. I mean, certainly, if we look back at Bill Clinton's run for the presidency back in '92, he went out of his way to emphasize that, you know, elect me president and I promise we will have the strongest military in the world and you don't have to worry about me using it. And indeed, he made good on that. Not in a very effective way, but certainly he demonstrated his willingness to intervene in ways mostly small, but not trivial over the course of his two terms. So Democrats have been trying to deal with that problem for a long, long time. You know, when I was still a serving officer, which is a long time ago now, this whole notion of the conservatism of the officer corps, way back then, my sense was, I didn't do polling, my sense was it did have a partisan dimension in the sense that my peers, I didn't necessarily share this view, but my peers were deeply appreciative of what they perceived to be the role played by Ronald Reagan in helping the force recover, both in a material and I think in an emotional sense, from the debacle of the war. And in that sense, for a time, there probably was a somewhat partisan taint in the views of the officer corps. It's been a long time since I served in uniform. We've got people here who are serving in uniform. I frankly would hope that the irresponsibility of the George W. Bush administration in its misuse of military power, which has inflicted considerable damage on our armed services. I would hope that experience would, in a sense, help to restore the traditional non-partisan self-identity. So the officer corps may still, in some senses, be conservative. Doesn't follow that they're in the pocket of one party or the other. But I don't really know what's going on.
I guess what I'm saying is that I think they are as late as 2010 when I was in the pocket I was from. But it would mean that the civil-military relations would break down in two different ways depending on whether Democrats or Republicans were in power. And it follows exactly the way it played out in history, which is at least recent history. Bush was able to override military advice, and he did so.
Well, but now, I would complicate the story a little bit, I think. I think it seemed pretty clear to me that Secretary Rumsfeld really had no use for any advice coming from the Joint Chiefs of Staff unless it was, yes, sir, we agree. And so it appears that in the run-up to the war, and probably in the early days of fighting the war, he chose rather consciously to marginalize the JCS. But in terms of overriding their views, I think if you look at the relationship between Rumsfeld and Tommy Franks, who was the CENTCOM commander in 2002 until what, some fall of 2003, roughly, it wasn't that he so much overrode Tommy Franks, as that he manipulated Tommy Franks. Tommy Franks was what was the old Lenin's useful idiot? Isn't that what Lenin's term? Tommy Franks became Rumsfeld's useful idiot. And we have pretty good evidence of this dialogue between Rumsfeld and Tommy Franks. And Tommy Franks would say, yeah, I think I need $500,000. And Rumsfeld would say, I think 125,000 is about right. Think about it a little bit more. Tommy Franks come back, well, how about maybe 375? And Rumsfeld would say, well, no, how about 150? And they went back and forth, and we ended up with an invasion force of what, 175? Thereabouts? 175? And with precious little thought to what's going to happen the day after we overthrow Saddam Hussein. Tommy Franks, it wasn't that Tommy Franks in a sense was ignored. It's that he, the regional commander, principal responsibility for planning and conduct of the war, allowed himself to be suckered in by these bogus theories related to the revolution and military affairs. And someone who one might have postulated that based on his own professional experience and professional education would have, certainly should have, resisted more effectively the model of warfare that Rumsfeld was attempting to impose upon him.
Do you think Obama could have found a useful idiot?
Well, no, I think because again, as I was trying to suggest in my talk, I think as a consequence, I mean, I think the Iraq surge is an utterly overrated event that did not achieve anything remotely like a victory. That what it really did was to allow Bush to move the goalposts in a significant way. I mean, this is an argument I make in my book, and that is that we need to understand why the administration chose to invade Iraq in 2003. And it sure as hell wasn't that Iraq posed a significant threat. And it sure as hell wasn't that Iraq had anything to do with 9/11. It was that Iraq was weak and vulnerable. That the purpose of invading Iraq was to provide an entry point into a very ambitious scheme concocted by a half dozen people, probably, at the very top of the Bush administration, that looked to a quick, decisive victory in Iraq as the means to initiate a far broader transformation of significant parts of the Islamic world. They needed a quick, decisive victory to validate the Bush doctrine of preventive war. Imagine if that had succeeded. Imagine the position that the United States would have found itself in relative to any adversaries in that region, quite frankly, any adversaries anywhere else in the world. If we had demonstrated that we possessed the will to engage in preventive war and to do so successfully, would have been a radical change in international politics. Guess what? They didn't get that victory. They got bogged down in that ugly insurgency that dragged on and on and on. So what happens by 2007 is that the Bush administration discovers that, no, that was never our objective. All we're trying to do is to pacify Iraq so we can get out. And the surge then, and the whole notion of counterinsurgency provides the means to do that. It's amusing to me, amusing not in a funny way, in a terrible way, that there were members of the officer corps in the wake of the putative success of the surge in Iraq who began to argue that coin had global application. You can go look up articles in places like Parameters. The coin as a global strategy. I mean, give me a break. So I think, but anyway, so Obama comes in, and when Obama comes in, this narrative, remember the famous line from Petraeus's dissertation, which is more or less similar to the quote from Henry Stimson, that it's not really what happens that matters, it's what people believe happened. And that's where we were at the time that Obama became presidency. It wasn't that the actual results of the Iraq War relative to the ambitions leading to the Iraq War that mattered. What mattered was that an image of success had now been created, a success ostensibly credited to a very specific four-star general. And I think that did change then the whole tenor of civil-military relations to Obama's disadvantage. Obama himself had made the problem worse, because you remember when he didn't run for the presidency in 2008 saying, our military enterprise in the Islamic world is misguided and stupid, elect me president and I will end it. No. He ran for the presidency saying, the Iraq war is stupid, elect me, I will end it, and the Afghanistan war is necessary, elect me and I will expand it. So he had, in a sense, already backed himself into a corner with regard to Afghanistan. Given the changing tenor of civil-military relations, McChrystal was in a position where he could produce a campaign plan that says there's only one option. And when you think about it, I don't know, maybe you see it differently. I mean, the very notion of a senior commander in wartime handing in a plan that says, Mr. President, you only have one choice, strikes me as an affront. And Obama ought to have shoved it down his throat and say, come back and give me three options. But of course, again, some of the circumstances I'm describing, we've got Petraeus endorsing the one and only approach. We've got McChrystal going on television. We've got the leaks to the Washington Post. Obama let himself be backed into a corner. Yes, sir.
I can compliment you. I mean, the only one I have heard, and I'll qualify that, I didn't get here till about 10 o'clock yesterday, is the only one I've heard mention the oath an officer takes. And many of us in this room have taken, and some of you are about to take again. And nobody's mentioned that, talking about civil-military relationships. That the allegiance we swear is to the Constitution of the United States.
So I don't want to be misunderstood. I was not endorsing General Newbold's interpretation. I think that interpretation is pernicious. Yes, we do, I did once, swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, but it seems to me that in that context, the chain of command is sacrosanct, and we need to know who the boss is, and the boss is the commander-in-chief. So I was not endorsing General Newbold's effort to revive what I referred to as the MacArthur Doctrine. I think that doctrine is exceedingly wrong-headed. We got time for one brief additional question, and I'm going to go catch an airplane. Or if there are none. Yes?
Let me follow up on my earlier question about Congress. It seems to me, and the most recent AUMF deliberation is a good example, right? It seems to me, sort of, under narrative, what you have are two sort of active participants in the arena who are committing, or engaged in what you might describe as a sense of commission. High-level civilians, high-level
I mean, the deep-seated corruption of our political system and the willingness of the American people to tolerate it. I mean, I'm a broken record, but I come back to the point that if the American people don't insist upon change, that change will not occur because the status quo may not serve the national interest, but it serves the interests of different constituents. The Congress is obviously happy with the way the political system functions. What's the re-election rate for incumbents? I think it's somewhere above 90%, is it not? They got no complaint about the way things work. They let themselves off the hook. It's disgraceful. The graph that, who was it, Charlie Dunlap showed, that shows that the Congress as essentially the least trusted major institution in the United States. I think we all knew that actually before he put up the graph. And yet there is no serious effort to address that situation. The American people don't like it and tolerate it. And to the extent that we claim to be a democracy, it seems to me that when you contemplate that reality, you're getting somewhere close to an understanding of what the problem is. So thanks very much. I really enjoyed the chance to talk to you.
Dr. Bacevich, on behalf of the Stockdale Center, please accept this small gift. Thanks, sir, and thank you for sharing your important
Thanks very much.
presentation and resulting discussion.